Thank you very much for inviting me for this talk. I just want to acknowledge my colleague and co-author, Eva right here. So she's sitting here, and also there's a team from Breakthrough, Binu, Bernali, and Vijay, who are sitting around in the middle of the room. So all of us are partners on this work. So it's what I'm going to present is joint work with many people. That is the product of the efforts of many people. So this is titled Intergenerational Transmission of Gender Attitudes. So the motivation for some of this work is fairly extensive discrimination against women that is pervasive throughout the life cycle. So women have face shortages in say health and nutritional provision early in life. Women tend to enroll in schools at much lower rates than boys do. Girls will also drop out of school much earlier than boys will. And in general, they'll have fewer occupational choice, lower mobility than boys. We also see some of the bad effects in terms of greater domestic violence, and also the practices like dowry, which I think are also forms of discrimination against women. Okay, excellent. So back on track. So the question is, why is there such extensive discrimination against women? And so, as social scientists, we tend to think in terms of cause and effect. So we say that, well, if there's discrimination, there must be some sort of underlying cause, and if only we can find that cause, we can solve it, and then we'd also have the effect of better behavior towards women. Okay, as economists in particular, we tend to think very strongly in terms of incentives and disincentives, right? So we tend to say that, look, if there's a shortfall in girls' education, then we should provide more scholarships. Or we tend to say that, look, if there's dowry practice, then we should just have anti-dowry legislation, and that will solve the problem. But I think the record has been that while on the margin, certainly it is true that most incentives and disincentives do work. I mean, ultimately they do affect behavior. They haven't been strong enough to actually solve the gender discrimination problem. So what we've been working with is another hypothesis, which is that can you affect what economists call preferences, but are more generally called attitudes? And hopefully, by addressing basic attitudes and views amongst people, can you make a dent on the issue of gender discrimination, and particularly improve gender-based outcomes? So the problem with working with attitudes is that, at least we're economists, so we tend to be a little skeptical that we understand attitudes well enough. So we know very little about the origin of attitudes. We don't know how they're formed, even though all of us hold these attitudes and preferences. We certainly know from a rich literature in psychology and other fields that attitudes tend to be very stable in life. So if you think about gender attitudes amongst 20-year-olds, that's pretty much the same attitudes that people will hold throughout their life. And it's very difficult to change people's attitudes later amongst adults. For children who are fairly young, it's very difficult to talk about attitudes, and particularly gender and other complicated topics. So we think that there might be a fairly small window to change attitudes amongst adolescents. So think about the teen years, where a lot of life questions are being resolved, and so gender attitudes themselves are being formed. So the teen years might be a time when you can actively address gender attitudes and hopefully shape them in a more gender equal way. So the final point over here is that the study that I'm going to talk about is basically an evaluation of an intervention. So the intervention is asking the question, can a school-based gender sensitization program change attitudes amongst adolescents that leads to better gender outcomes? And so what I'm going to do today is to talk, the focus of my talk is basically on two things. So as researchers, what we're doing is trying to evaluate whether an intervention, a school-based intervention to change gender attitudes actually works or not. But I'm going to limit my attention largely on two major topics. So one is I'm going to talk about how do we measure gender attitudes, because it's not entirely clear. How do you operationalize this, gender attitudes in terms of quantitative measures or even qualitative measures? And I'm going to tell you a little bit about the special methods that we have developed for measuring gender attitudes, and so that's going to be about half the talk. The other half is going to be about the intergenerational transmission of gender attitudes. What I mean by that is that we have conducted a survey, and that the data from that survey allows us to understand a little bit about the formation of gender attitudes. What are the factors that drive more gender equal or unequal attitudes amongst the adolescents? So given that, what we can take a look at is what is the role of parents' attitudes in influencing children's attitudes? And this is perhaps an important question even for the intervention, because ultimately, if parents' attitudes are completely deterministic in determining their children's attitudes, then it's unlikely that the intervention will have any effect at all. Right? We'd also like to see what is the effect of school-based environment on adolescents' attitudes. So we have a bunch of peers, and so do they also have an effect on adolescents' attitudes? And so we'd like to know some of that. So those are the two big questions that we're going to ask about the formation of gender attitudes, and so look at some of the quantitative results that we have found from our baseline survey. Then, of course, I have a lot of material in the room, but unfortunately, the 25 minutes that I have, I'm not perhaps going to get to actually describing the school-based intervention. So, in the question and answer time, most probably we will have enough time to discuss the school-based intervention as well, and I'm happy to describe the intervention in more detail. Okay, so that's the plan for today's talk. If you, hopefully that's fine. So here's where we are conducting our survey. Right, so the study is being conducted in 4 districts of Haryana. So these are the 4 districts which are largely surrounding Delhi. So that's Panipat, Sonipat, Rohtak, and Jhajjar. And so the dots represent different secondary schools in Haryana, which are all run by the government. So the important thing is that all of these schools have at least 6th through 9th grade in them. So 6th grade because that's where we started our baseline, and then 7th, 8th, and 9th is where the intervention will take place. And so what's particular about these districts is that they're fairly close to Delhi, and yet they have some of the poorest, child sex ratio in the whole country. So from that perspective, I think that these districts are important to study. So here's the study population. Here's where we gathered the data from. So these are government, as I mentioned earlier, government secondary schools. Students in grades 6 through 7 at the time of the survey. Can people hear me without this mic? Yes? Yeah. Okay, great. So the study this baseline survey was conducted from September 2013 to January 2014. The students, so what we did is we went to, so there are 314 schools that are part of our study. 150 of them are going to be treatment schools for the intervention, and 164 as control schools for the intervention that will help us evaluate the intervention. But within these 314 schools, what we did is to pick 40 plus odd kids at random, and then survey those students whose parents provided consent, so their parents are providing written consent, and the students themselves are providing assent to being surveyed in question. So within that, we have about an 84% response rate. So 16% of the sample we did not interview. But fortunately for us, this 84% number and consent, the determinants of consent are sort of uncorrelated with any other kind of important observational characteristic that we could consider. Within the set of students, we also randomly picked a 40% sample, right? And then we followed them home and went to the home and randomly picked either the father or the mother to interview. Right, so this is a bunch of fathers and mothers for 40% of the students, and the response rates for the fathers is about 70%, which is a little bit lower, which is lower than the 89% for mothers. It's not surprising. Most fathers, many fathers go away for work, and so during the daytime when we're conducting our interviews, they're kind of hard to find. So you have to repeatedly go back, and we found 70% of fathers, but in case we could not find either father or mother, we picked a replacement household and then interviewed them. So our final sample in this study consists of 14,800 students and 6,100 parents. And so I'm going to tell you a little bit more about this. So if it's been a while since you went to Haryana and visited a secondary school, so here's what a secondary school looks like. These are not students who are part of our sample, by the way. So this is just some photos from the schools. Here's a classroom within a school. So you can see that the gender segregation is pretty severe, even though it's a co-ed school. So here are the girls, here are the boys, and here's a guy in a wheelchair, and he has to sit with a boy because he's a boy, right? So this gender segregation is pretty extreme. And finally, here's an interview actually being in progress, right? So here's a respondent. And so he's responding to our enumerator. So it was pretty important for our study to have appropriate kinds of enumerators. You don't want Ankuji types like me. going and asking questions. So what you want is like younger bhaiya didi types who are closer to age to the respondents. So getting students comfortable with our enumerators is important, but I think we also have this big question about, sure, we're trying to address gender attitudes, but we have very little idea of what's a good way to actually measure gender attitudes. What are sort of appropriate tests for, so globally we don't have very little idea of what is a good measure of gender attitudes, but more specifically, we don't know how, say, 10 to 14-year-olds respond to any kind of testing or surveying. And this is a very particular kind of context as well that we have to consider. So as social scientists, we know a lot about social desirability bias. So people tend to respond in a way that they think the enumerator will approve. And so we thought a lot about that. But I think the bigger problem was just poor communication skills. So the enumerator comes out from beyond the school and they ask you a bunch of questions. The final survey was almost 45 minutes long. And so it's very tiring for students to respond. And they don't have a lot of experience talking about their views or beliefs. No one has really asked them before. And so these communication skills were also something that we actively had to take into account when we were developing the survey, something that we hadn't really anticipated before. Then we also had to make sure that the survey was feasible to implement. As I mentioned, each individual survey would be about 45 minutes, but the whole survey itself lasted 5 months. And so there's a survey length, there's a time issue, and it's very expensive. These are also the monsoon months, so not only is there low attendance rates for kids to school, but also our enumerators found it very difficult to always reach schools every day, right? Because the rains would wash out the roads. So there are also lots of issues that come up, operational issues that come up when you want to measure gender attitudes. And so I'm going to cut a long story short and just talk about like 3 types of metrics that we developed, 3 ways in which to measure gender attitudes. So one is that we just ask direct questions, right? So I'm going to talk about that. The second is a vignette or a story that we used in order to measure attitudes. And the final is an implicit association test. Basically, a tool developed by psychologists to overcome social desirability bias, right? So we had 3 measures. And in the end, I don't think I have the results, but all 3 measures basically tell the same story. Right, so here's some direct questions on gender attitudes. And so we just asked the students, the respondents on a 5-point scale. You strongly agree, are you neutral, do you disagree, or you strongly disagree? And so we had a very large list of questions to start with. But many of these questions are just beyond the context of what we're trying to measure, or the students don't understand them, or for some other reason we had to just stop them. And so we ended up with about 9 questions. So I'm just going to read these out. A woman's most important role is being a good homemaker. A man should have the final word about decisions in his home. A woman should tolerate violence to keep her family together. Wives should be less educated than their husbands. Boys should get more opportunities or resources for education than girls. Men and women should get equal opportunities in all spheres of life, for example, in education. Girls should be allowed to study as far as they want. And daughters should have a similar right to inherited property as sons. And it would be a good idea to elect a woman as village servant. So we asked these questions directly and asked students whether they agree or disagree on a 5-point scale. And so just to give you a sense of how we find these questions very useful, look at this response. So this is just by district, boys and girls, boys in blue, girls in red. And so you say girls should be allowed to study as far as they want. Actually, there's a lot of agreement to this question, right? So 80+%, so lowest is 83%, whereas largely everyone agrees that girls should be allowed to study as much as they want. And so that's fine. But if you ask yourself the same question in a slightly different way, so wives should be less educated than their husbands. So suddenly you see much more gender differences in the response rates. Boys tend to agree with this idea much more. Many more than would be suggestive of this sort of responses to this question. And so you can't have both things holding simultaneously. You can't have girls studying as much as they want and saying that there's wives in general should be less educated than their husbands. So this is in some ways helping us understand what are some reasons why girls tend to drop out far faster than boys do. There might be, for example, a marriage market constraint to education as well. So this is how we use the direct questions. the vignette basically describes a family with twins, so it's a boy and a girl, Rakhi and Rajat, and both of them have finished school, high school, and they want to go to a nearby town to study in a college. And so their father has enough money, their family has enough money to send only one, but the father decides to send the boy and not the girl. And so what do we learn from this? And so, Rakhi will stay home, the girl will stay home and help with household chores, and eventually get married. So the advantage of using a vignette is that it really helps the students, our respondents, to think of a situation which is not their own, right? And so they're not necessarily looking at it in their own context. And so here we see very stark differences in the views of boys and girls. So boys tend to agree with the decision to send the boy to school, and girls not so much. On the other hand, if you ask a question which is specifically, say, about safety, then there's much more agreement that both boys and girls tend to agree that staying alone in the town is not safe for the girl. Right? So this might be a question of fact. Towns might be much more unsafe than villages. Finally, I want to describe the implicit association test. So this is basically a computer-based test, right? Implemented on laptops, which was developed by psychologists in labs in the US. And the idea was to detect the strength of a person's automatic association. So how fast does your brain associate certain categories with others? Just to give you an example, you might associate you want to ask yourself, how fast does your mind associate women with humanities and men with engineering relative to men with humanities and women with engineering, right? So if you feel that the first association happens much faster compared to the second set of associations, right? So that's what we want to test. This categorization is done fairly quickly. So think of like playing a video game. So it has to happen very quickly, and so and the speed of association isn't done by hand or by a person, but by the software, which is why the computer-based test is very useful. And so, of course, the problem with using the implicit, the IIT was that it was largely developed in the US. There are very few examples of the IIT successfully deployed in India, and certainly none for gender amongst children, right, in Haryana. So we also know that this test is very sensitive to context. So we had to create our own IIT, which involved quite a bit of piloting in these schools. In particular, we were fortunate that many school teachers were happy to contribute their views on what are appropriate terms and what are appropriate pictures to use in this test. Right. So here's another example of the sort of images that that you've seen on the IIT. So here you have a bad word, durbhagya, which means unlucky, and you can associate it with, on the left-hand side, you have to press the left button to say that, well, this could be either a boy or a good word, right? On the right-hand side, it's a girl and a bad. So here, a boy, here's a girl, and you press right? And here's a good word, kamyab, which means successful, on the left, which is the left word, so you press the left one. But then what I do is we switch the categories around, right? So now we associate, on the left button is girls with good words and boys with bad words. Right? And so badmashi, which means naughty. Here's a boy, here's a girl, and samajhdar, which means someone who's, what's a good samajhdar? Right? Sorry?
Sensible.
Sensible, yes, which is supposed to be good. So, I mean, I would have never thought that, say, words like lucky or sensible are necessarily good concepts. But in the context of these schools, this is exactly it. Right? So, we're very fortunate that there are lots of teachers who are happy to contribute their knowledge. So here's a couple of students taking one of the pilot IITs. They're very excited to take the IIT. It's a great thrill to have someone come in and show them a laptop, and they get to play on the laptop, and it's like a video. So, so here's a snapshot of the findings from the IIT. So not surprisingly, we find that boys are much more, so this is measuring the implicit preference for boys, and this is the negative, is implicit preference for girls. I don't think it was surprising that boys are pro-male, but what was surprising is that girls aren't gender neutral. Girls are very strongly pro-female, even more so than the boys are pro-male. So, so this is one example of a finding that we got from the implicit association test. But I mentioned three ways in which we were measuring gender attitudes, is that the findings of all three ways are correlated. And so the nice thing was that we're able to triangulate our measures of gender attitudes and pretty much find consistent results. So we are fairly confident that what we're picking up is roughly accurate and a good way to measure gender attitudes, right? So these are some of the findings that we have, or methods that we developed as part of this study. I also now want to turn to discussing the formation of gender attitudes, right? So
sorry, Tarun,
yes.
see what you think that graph is saying.
Yes. So I would not put a interpretation to the scale. So what this is saying is that so this is a 0 line. If you're positive means implicit preference for boys, pro-male views, and a negative means pro-female views. So what I think was, so the blue is boys' results and red is girls' results. So I think the unsurprising part of the finding is that boys are pro-male. But the surprising part of the finding is that girls are not gender neutral.
Why is that surprising?
Well, so maybe, perhaps, fair enough. So we didn't have a...
No, you're saying girls think girls are good and boys think boys are good.
Yes.
Boys are good.
So neither the boys nor the girls are neutral. Boys overall are pro-male and girls are strongly pro-female.
Sorry, it's not time for the discussion, but it's also gender polarized context. So you will get what you're finding.
Sure, yeah, so, I think when we did some qualitative work, what we found is that there's very little interaction between boys and girls, even in co-ed schools.
Yeah.
Right? So
That's
the universe of girls is their friends are other girls, and boys are people that they just don't interact with very much, except that the interactions tend to be very negative if they report it. So I don't think, from that perspective, I agree with you, it's not surprising. Okay, so I do want to talk about now the formation of gender attitudes and specifically the role of parents in informing gender attitudes. So how are adolescents' gender attitudes affected by the parents' attitudes? Well, we can ask whether mothers or fathers are more influential. We can ask whether girls or boys are more influenced, and particularly, we can look at the mapping within the family. Mothers influencing girls, father is influencing girls, mother influencing boys, and father is influencing boys. But in order to perhaps understand parents' roles, we can also benchmark our findings to what the effect of the peers is. Right? So we can look at whether or not peers are also influential in this setting or not. So finally, what we're going to do is to look at not only the effect of parents' attitudes on the gender attitudes of the kids, but also on things like the aspirations of the kids, right? So whether they hope to study much more, and that might be an important outcome for our study. So here's a snapshot of our findings. So yes, boys have more pro-male bias than girls, but so boys and girls are very different. So young boys and young girls are very different. Boys are more pro-male, girls are more pro-female, but fathers and mothers are very similar to each other. So this is an important finding. So girls seem to become more pro-male as they age, right? So this is something that we found, but this could also be cohort effects, right? So the girls in our study were basically born in this century. So their mothers were born in the 20th century. So it could just be that influences over time have changing. So I'm not necessarily saying that a given person transitions as they age, but it might be that your cohort changes over time. So here's what so from this data what we have, because we tracked down parents of each of the students who we surveyed in the school, we have child-parent pairs, right? So we have either a boy or a girl, and then we have their father or their mother. So we have a bunch, more than 5,800 child-parent pairs, and then I can take a look at the child's gender attitudes, that's what this is, child gender attitudes, as a function of parent gender attitudes and so on and so forth. But then in order to do to make sure that, so in order to make sure that we're accurately capturing this transmission, we also want to make one important correction. Right? So who goes to a government school in Haryana is not the same for boys and girls. Right? So in general, girls tend to come from wealthier families, boys tend to come from poorer families, which is not surprising. What happens in wealthier families is that boys transition to private schools. So private school attendance rates in Haryana are very high. And it's primarily boys who transition starting in secondary school from public secondary school, so government run secondary schools to private run secondary schools. So we have to make that strong, we have to correct for that. that. And so what we do is to also include a vector which tells us something about the likelihood of being a boy in a government school in Haryana, which is a function of pretty much every observable household characteristic that we know, right, and captured in this. We also include school fixed effects, so that captures everything about the school or the village, right, which is common across different, so all the characteristics of the school or village are captured by that term. That means that we're basically comparing two kids who are within the same school and village, right? We also include gender, class, and district fixed effects. So anything that is common across two different girls who are in the same class, in the same district, is being, so basically think of it this way. We're comparing two girls in the same class, in the same district, right? So that's the comparison, and also within the same school. And so here are the basic findings. So one is that parents have a very strong influence on their kids' gender attitudes. So this gender index is being formed by basically taking these 9 questions. So I take these 9 questions and form a gender index. Right? So the way I form the gender index is for each question I assign a progressive answer. Right? And if you strongly agree or agree with that progressive answer, then that is a 1 and a 0 otherwise. And so our gender index can be any number between 0 and 9. So that's the gender index. And so what we find is that parents have a very strong influence on the gender attitudes of their kids. So a 1 standard deviation increase in the parent's gender index increases the student's gender index by 14%. So that's, I think, a large effect. We're happy it's not 1. If it was 1, then there's no way in which a school-based intervention can have any effect at all. Right? So only 14% of gender index, students' gender attitudes are explained by the parents' gender attitude, and in some ways 80+% still remains to be explained. So that's a positive finding. Within the set of parents, we find that mothers are much more influential than fathers. Right? So fathers have virtually no effect on the gender attitudes of their kids. And so we find that in general girls are less progressive than their parents are, but there's no strong effect of girls. Right? So I'm not going to, so the results that we find for girls versus boys are not significant, and they tend to qualitatively change across different stratifications, so they're not very robust. Okay. So,
Excuse me.
Yes.
What is that 1 and 2? There are 2 columns in the previous slide.
Yes. So these are just different specifications, right? So I can run a short. So I look at I look at parents' gender index and influencing students' gender index, plus the girls.
No, but these 2 columns.
Yes, I'm saying that. So in the second column, I also include mother's effects. Right? So you want to ask yourself, what is the pure effect of parents? And within that, you might also be interested in, well, not just parents overall, but just the mother specifically. Right? So the second column helps us to uncover the effects of the mother's views or gender index on the student's gender index, and we see that it's 23%. Right? Okay. Okay. So we find positive correlation between the parents and the child's gender attitudes, and a stronger effect of the mother, right? Which is a very robust finding. So mothers are highly influential on their kids in general. There's no special effect on girls. So it's not as if girls versus boys are particularly susceptible to their parents' influence. Okay. We've done all sorts of robustness checks. We've come up with different ways to put in the fixed effects and so on and so forth. So econometrically, we've checked our results in various different ways, and so we found these basic findings to be fairly robust. Right? You might also be concerned that, well, I've come up with a gender index, right, which is basically looking at 9 different questions and asking ourselves, well, on a combined index which combines all 9 questions, this was the result. Was there any particular questions where the intergenerational transmission of gender attitudes was particularly strong or weak? We find that in 7 of the 9 questions, pretty much we get the very consistent results. Okay? The The only places where we don't have a strong influence of parents on children's attitudes is on women, and is on the question of men and women should get equal opportunities in all spheres of life. And the second one is girls should be allowed to study as far as they want, which is not surprising. There's a lot of agreement on these questions anyway. More than 90% of parents and kids agree on this question. So we don't find a strong influence of parents on this. Virtually everyone agrees, so it's not surprising. Okay, so we did a principal component analysis, which is, yes.
Can I ask a question? I didn't understand the model because I didn't know whether you had pooled the data, because you had father's data and you had mother's data.
Yes, so I have
So you
1500.
pool the data and you
Yes.
just control for mother's fixed effects.
Mhm.
When you, so you, in the households where only the father is the respondent,
Mhm.
you have a fixed effect for the mother's transmission through the girl. I mean, you have the interaction of the mother and the daughter in this. You have father's data and you have mother's data, and they're all pooled. So at some point, you are actually looking at the parental transmission
Well,
as agnostic.
Can we discuss this?
Okay.
Happy please.
Okay.
I just had a quick clarificatory question as well. So you were saying there are these pairs, right? So a child and a mother, or a child and a father. So it could be a daughter and a father and a mother and a son.
Yeah.
So that, have you tried to control for that?
Yes, that's exactly. Yeah. We have to. So those are the four different ways in which we can combine, right? And we can take a look at different transitions. So we find okay. A principal component analysis is so I'm not going to discuss the principal component analysis, right? So we can also take a look at a different outcome variable, which is different from the gender index or attitude measure, and this is aspiration. Right? So this is asking the student whether the student aspires to study beyond, continue education beyond high school, or what we call 13 plus, and whether parents have an influence on their kids' attitudes, aspirations. And so over here, what we find is the main. So when your parents have relatively gender equal attitudes, then the girls are much more likely to aspire to study much more. Right? So, and that's not surprising either. Basically, our belief is that girls take their cues from parents. If the parents are saying, yes, you can study much more, then naturally the aspirations work out. So what we're hoping for is that, in our headline study, when we go back and survey these kids again, what we find is that more gender equal views of the parents actually lead to less dropout rates for girls, because so far we only look at the statistics. We can compare the effects of classmates and parents, and compare whether parents are more influential or less influential than the classmates. What we found is that the classmates collectively are about as influential as the parents, right? So, of course, obviously, one friend is not going to have the same effect as one parent, but the classmates overall in the school are going to have as much effect as a single parent. And so, in some ways, this is good news for the school-based intervention. If you can change the norms in one set of the class, it's going to have, hopefully, some effect on the others through their peers. So, from that perspective, I think this is good news for the intervention. So, here's the summary of what we've found. Parents' gender attitudes affect children's attitudes. Mothers are far more influential than the fathers. Some suggestive evidence that mothers shape girls' attitudes, but this is by no means conclusive, and it's not very robust finding. And parents' attitudes also affect children's aspirations, and girls will want to obtain more education if their parents hold relatively gender equal views, right? And collectively, of course, parents are as influential as parents. Peers are as influential as parents. Right? So, for the moment, I'm just going to wrap up this part with some implications. So, what we're seeing from the baseline survey is a set of findings which help us understand the formation of gender attitudes. And so we think that actually addressing these gender attitudes at this stage in their lives is very important. One is that we want to halt the apparent erosion. So we're not too sure if this is actually happening with these girls or not. But there is one view that there is an erosion of gender equal norms as you grow older. So, and so we want to stop that at adolescence right here. Right? And then, of course, what we want is these students to get into a virtuous cycle. So if you have relatively gender positive views, well, tomorrow these students are also going to be parents themselves. And so if they have gender equal attitudes, then hopefully their children will also have gender equal attitudes. And so it leads to a more virtuous cycle. And so I think this is where the school-based intervention is particularly important. And so I don't have enough time to address that school-based intervention, but I have some pictures which are either from Breakthrough's earlier work or from this intervention itself. There is a lot of discussion of aspirations. There are cartoons and comic books being developed. There's a youth club called Taro Kitori, Group of Stars, right? So on and so forth. And so I'm happy to discuss that in more detail, perhaps during the Q&A session. All right.